In this presentation, we will review our practice problem number 4. If you don't have access to this QuickBooks file, that's okay. We're going to be creating this file from scratch, starting it with a new QuickBooks file and moving forward from it. This will be the end result so we can see where we're going to end up at the end of that process. Here we are in our QuickBooks file. It's going to be number 4, job costing using classes. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown and the open windows list. Let's review our Excel sheet to see what our objectives are once again. Going into the Excel sheet, we're going to be doing much the same process here. So we're going to be using the same technique on the second Excel sheet where we're not going to be going through the work in process, but basically recording everything to the cost of goods sold in the class tracking. You kind of have to do that if you're going to use a class tracking method, because the point of the class tracking is it will be breaking out the income statement items down below. And that's how we're going to be able to run something like the job cost sheet. Now, the benefits to the class tracking item, we're not going to be going through the work in process or the finished goods, but you'll end up with a report in a similar fashion that if we can tie out the job cost sheet, cost of goods sold to the sheets, you can easily do adjusting entries at the end of the process. The other thing that's nice about this method is you don't have to do as many kind of funny things with regards to like the double-sided items that you need to set up for the other methods, and doing things like creating forms that don't do what you would think the normal form would do, like writing a check that isn't really a check. Now, under the first method, when we went to work in process, then finished goods, then we had to do more of that kind of funny stuff. We had to write checks and do types of things to transfer items from work in process to finished goods with the use of the items. When we then use the method where we're going to the cost of goods sold and problems 2 and 3, we limited that, but we're still kind of forced to use the forms to drive the transactions. If you use this method, then you're going to be able to use the forms in a lot more logical method. In other words, if we go back to QuickBooks, you'll recall that last time, in order to use the items that we have set up, we did things like write checks, possibly write checks with a zero balance. Sometimes we'll actually create a sales receipt that doesn't actually go to the customer. It's not designed. It doesn't serve the function that you would think a sales receipt would serve. And that can be really confusing to people. And those double-sided items can be kind of confusing to people. So if you want like a more really straightforward type of method that basically will allow you to use the normal methods of the data input, then the class tracking method might be a reasonable one to use. Also note that if you use class tracking, we're not typically using the estimated estimates. We're not going to be comparing estimates to actual. So if you want something in QuickBooks that's going to be able to compare an estimate that you make within QuickBooks to the actual, then typically the class tracking isn't going to be the method, doesn't going to provide that. But if you do the estimates outside of the system, or you have your own method for doing estimates and you want to enter the actual data into QuickBooks, you want to be able to invoice within QuickBooks, you want a simple method that you can put together and use the forms that are all like kind of designed as they're designed to do, then you might want to consider something like using the classes. Now, to use class tracking, you got to turn on the classes, and that's going to be in the edit up top into the preferences. And we're just going to turn on the class, which is in the accounting up top and then the company preferences. So that's the first thing that we obviously have to do if we're going to use the class tracking. Then we're going to close this out. The main thing that let's take a look at our reports now. If we go to the reports drop down, if we go to the company and financial and we take a look at the profit and loss standard, you'll see if I change the dates, 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. We have a similar type of profit and loss where we have set up the same kind of accounts as we did in the second method with more detail. We have the cost of goods sold accounts that we can break out here. We then have the more detail in the direct labor, materials, and factory overhead. We set up separate accounts under the subcategory just as we did with the prior method. So we can use the same thing there. The major difference is we're not going to be using the job cost sheet reports, but instead the profit and loss by class report. So what that looks like is if we go up top and we go to the profit and loss or company and financials, then we want the profit and loss by class report. Profit and loss by class, changing the dates up top from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. We then have the profit and loss, and it's broken out by the classes. And so obviously we then will name the classes up top as the jobs, that will be involved, jobs 14, 15, and 16, and that'll give us our information, basically our job cost sheet in that format. Now, it can be a little bit intimidating to look at this sheet, but you can collapse items as well to go through this. So as we set up a sheet like this, what we'll end up doing is we will go to the lists drop down, and we have this new list called class list. And we have the same kind of issue to track the jobs that are open and the jobs that are closed. So we could set up subclasses like so. We have the closed in the current year, the open classes, and then we may want to set up different classes for admin and selling so that we can break those out into their own class or not. That would be an optional method. We'll discuss that more as we go through this component of the problem. And then if you go back to the profit and loss report, then you can use these collapsing columns to collapse or expand the classes so that you can maneuver the report pretty nicely. These are a fairly new item to be able to collapse these classes. Now, if we wanted to see the full job, note that if I'm in, for example, job number 14, you'll recall that it had some of the work that was done in the prior year. So we have to be careful of that as well and be able to run a report. We have to say, okay, this job it's showing the $150,000 in cost of goods sold because it was open last year. So I'd have to open it as of last year to get that full, 191 for 140 for the entire job. And we would have the same kind of reconciling issue if we went back over here and reconciled. We'd want to be able to reconcile it out. And as long as we were to do our little reconciliation, we should be able to convert it to whatever method is needed at year end. So to enter this information, if we go to the Home tab and we were say to write checks, if we're going to write a check, then we can go back and note the checks are just basically normal checks like this, right? We don't go to the expense tab. I don't have to basically deal with the item information in order to write a check. We can just simply write the check straight to an account, just like we normally would. We'd write the check, and then we're going to assign it to the class here, which we're going to say the class is the job. So as long as we assign everything out, it works really well. Now, we still want to set up these customers or the jobs here. Why? Because that could help us with the billable items. So we could make it billable. That helps us to set up the invoice. But for a lot of people, I think it would be a lot easier if you could just use the expenses tab and not have to set up those double-sided items and just remember to assign it to a class. Then if you forget to assign it to a class, it'll be easy to see because 1, it'll give you a warning here, and 2, if you go to the profit and loss report and you run this report and you see anything that's in cost of goods sold, like you can collapse the cost of goods sold, and if you see anything that's in the uncategorized section, in this section, that's in a cost of goods sold line item, then you can go in there and say, oh, something wasn't assigned out. You can go and you can locate it, and you can just basically double click on whatever is not assigned to the proper place. You can go into that item, and then you can find where it wasn't assigned, where the class wasn't assigned, and then simply assign the class. So it's a bit more straightforward in this way because you don't have to use those double-sided items, and you don't end up with those things where you have the checks that have kind of a zero check or anything like that. When you set up the items, if I go to lists up top in the item list, I still set up the items here, but notice we just set them up for the invoicing process like you would normally set up a service item. In other words, if I go into the item, we see it's not double-sided. This item wasn't used for us to write the checks and the bills, but just to make the invoice. So at the end of the job then, to make the invoice, or periodically throughout the job, depending on how you think about it, we're going to go to the profit and loss, and you can create the invoice basically looking at the job that is going to be closed. So if we're looking at job number 14, we can then go down to the bottom of job number 14, make sure we run the date range so that we see the entire job, and then we see the bottom line, which is going to be the gross profit for job number 14, which is, or we're going to see the cost of goods sold, because we wouldn't have the income yet if we haven't entered it yet. So it's going to be the 191, 140, and then you can create the invoice from it, meaning you're in essence going to recreate these accounts as items, but just one-sided items that would then be on the income statement. on that would be reported in the invoice that will then show on the income statement under income. So if I go into the income account, then we go into this invoice, then we see these items. These items are the ones that would be set up, but again, they're not double-sided. We just set them up to give us that same kind of detail within the invoice. We created them so that we can then give the transparency. This is exactly what we spent the money on for this particular job, and then show the markup in a similar way as the prior method.